Just over a week ago, Tuesday, November 11th, I paid a visit to Toronto Metropolitan University, Hillel. I went not to be part of a panel, not for a rally, not for a speech. I went to sit with Jewish students, to be with them on the Tuesday after the November 5th attack on Students Supporting Israel event featuring IDF veterans. I went simply to listen, to support, and to try to understand what it was they were experiencing on campus. And what they described was not subtle. They told me that Jewish students on campus feel unsafe, that they live with harassment, intimidation, and open hostility, that the physical assault at the SSI event was not an isolated incident, but the eruption of a climate that has been building for the last several years. And most painfully, they told me this: the university has policies, it just doesn't enforce them. Policies about harassment, policies about student safety, policies about disruptive conduct or violent conduct. Policies that every other minority on campus sees consistently enforced. But the student said, when it's us, nothing happens. That sentence should break the heart of each and every one of us. It should break the heart of Canadians all over the land. In Toldot, in this week's Torah reading, Yitzchak, Isaac encounters a moment of moral tension. Jacob approaches to receive a blessing, and the Torah tells us as Isaac hears Hakol Kol Yaakov, the voice is the voice of Jacob, but feels V'hayadayim Yedei Esav. But the hands that he's touching are the hands of Esav, of Esau. The classical commentators on the Torah linger here. Rashi says that Isaac noticed the derech eretz in Jacob's speech, respect, humility, gentleness, and yet the hands felt harsh and foreign. Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, notes that Isaac sensed contradiction and should have investigated, but didn't. And Ramban Nachmanides is pointed. Isaac chose not to confront the inconsistency because it was easier emotionally to accept what he wished was true. This is the definition of willful blindness. When everything you need to see is right in front of you, but you prefer not to see it. This tragically is exactly what we are witnessing at TMU and at university campuses all across North America. The voice of the university, like the voice of Jacob, speaks the language of inclusion, diversity, equity, and zero tolerance for hate. But the hands, the actions, look very different. They look like inaction after violence, silence after intimidation, administrative delay after Jewish students are hurt. A university whose voice says the right things and whose hands do nothing is living in the moral dissonance of Kol Yaakov v'Yedei Esav. This gap between values and action, between the voice and the hands, is precisely what political philosopher Hannah Arendt warns about in her book Eichmann in Jerusalem. Arendt did not claim that evil is ordinary. She claimed that evil is made possible when ordinary people and institutions refuse to think morally. She writes, "The sad truth is that most evil is done by people who never make up their minds to be good or evil. And further, evil comes from a failure to think, a refusal to examine the reality of what one is doing. Arendt is describing exactly how institutions betray their stated values, not through malice, but through bureaucratic paralysis. Neutrality masquerading as virtue and an unwillingness to confront the consequences of inaction. TMU does not wake up in the morning intending to harm Jewish students. But Arendt would say, moral harm occurs whenever procedure replaces conscious, and when responsibility is avoided because it's uncomfortable. This is the danger she calls the banality of evil. Not monstrous hated, but everyday refusal to act on what one knows. TMU's leadership knows what happened on November 5th. They know that their students feel endangered. They know their policies are not being enforced. The question Arendt would ask is not what were their intentions, but rather, why did they refuse to think long enough to act? When I sat with the students on that Tuesday, that is what came through most clearly. They feel the weight of a double standard, that if any other minority were attacked, physically assaulted, there would be immediate public denunciations, suspensions, mandatory trainings, and swift disciplinary consequences. But when Jews are attacked, it becomes under review. It becomes complex. It becomes, we're looking into it. That is the gap between the voice and the hands. The students told me they want to feel safe, and they want to know that someone cares, and that the university will act, not theoretically, not eventually, but now. The Torah demands not only speech but action, not only values but behavior. In fact, moral principle only matters when it's challenged. In Deuteronomy, we read, Lo tuchal lehit'alem, you must not hide yourself. The rabbis expand this into a principle. If you can intervene but don't, you bear responsibility for the harm that follows. Hannah Arendt calls this the failure to think. The Torah calls it hit'almut, self-concealment, avoidance. They are all describing the same moral truth. When we know and do not act, we ultimately abandon one another. And so this is where we are called, not to yell, not to inflame, not to politicize, but to insist calmly, clearly, forcefully, persistently, that TMU, that other universities, that all other institutions that seem to be willfully blind between the moral gap between their voice and their hands, enforce their own policies. We're not asking them necessarily to create new policies, but the policies that are on the books should be implemented with fairness for all, especially for Jewish students. This is not about privilege. This is not about exceptionalism. This is not about Israeli politics. This is about safety, equity, and responsibility. Jewish students deserve the same protection that any student should expect on a Canadian campus. And TMU's leadership is accountable for ensuring that. Now, I sent this sermon to the president of TMU, to one of our members of our synagogue and board, who is one of the vice presidents of TMU, and to other leaders of TMU. I'm not just giving this sermon here and asking you to do something that I myself have not done. But I have a call to action for all of us here if we care about these issues. And the call to action is very simple. I ask alumni, parents, donors, concerned citizens, call TMU, write them, meet with them, hold them to their word, not to punish, but to awaken, to help them see what they have failed to see, to think where they have refused to think, and most importantly, to act where conscience demands action. In Toldot, Yitzhak Isaac eventually discovers the truth. And the Torah tells us at that moment, Vayecherad Yitzchak charada gedola ad ma'od, that Isaac trembled a very great trembling. Rashi says he trembled because he suddenly saw the consequences of failing to act when he should have acted. This is the tremble of moral awakening, a moment when the gap between voice and hand is finally confronted. We pray that TMU and others will have such a moment, not out of fear, but out of conscience, responsibility, and integrity. And until that day, may we refuse to look away. May we refuse to be bystanders. May our hands match our voices, and may our students know without question that we stand beside them until justice is done. Shabbat Shalom.